I want to thank our new paid subscriber, Hope. You guys are awesome. The goal is 100 paid subscribers. Your patronage makes Inner Immigrant possible, so thank you so much for your support. I want to reintroduce my guest, even though she's been on the show before. Ashleen is a professor of political science at Texas State, and she specializes in American politics. So she's a fantastic fit for Inner Immigrant. She's received numerous teaching awards. She's been a fellow at Princeton, so I really appreciate her intelligence and also her background. Ashleen, I would like to say maybe it's a generalization, but I don't think you come from the most typical background of a university professor. You are a Tejano. You are from South Central Texas,
Mhm.
and you grew up in a working class community. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So I feel like not only your incredible intelligence and your integrity, but also your background make you such an interesting person to speak to. Because a lot of professors of political science maybe grew up, in Brooklyn in a wealthy family. And so you have life experience as well as your research that you bring to bear on what's happening in American politics.
Thank you. Actually, with you saying I have a picture of my grandpa who right next to me. I keep it in my office. Let me get it.
I want to see it.
So this is my grandpa,
Okay.
Menchaca, and this was s- from the time when he served in the military, and yeah, he's probably, aside from my mom, the most important person in my life. So I keep him in my office so that I can always remember, the things he taught me. And he grew up as a migrant worker. His family is migrant workers. And around when he was like 15, he got apprenticed to a butcher so he wouldn't have to move around anymore. Um, but a lot, I I guess I see in a lot of my students, I see him. And so I put him in my office so that I can kind of just, remember.
That's beautiful. What kind of work were your parents doing when you were a kid?
So my dad was in construction, and my mom is actually a teacher. And so it was like a very interesting experience because on my mom's side, she was the first one to go to college, and that was like a huge deal. My grandpa used to call her his mini teacher because she's really short. Um, and like I think that I don't. It was interesting growing up because my dad was very like, I guess you'd say, kind of skeptical of education, but my mom was an educator. And so it was a nice combination. I felt like. I remember when I got into graduate school and I called my dad to tell him I got into Notre Dame. Um, he only said one thing, and it was, "Are you going to get health insurance?" And so that was kind of, you know, I don't know, that was a lot of what my life was informed by. And I actually worked in my dad's, because then him and some friends opened up, like a air conditioning company. And when I was in high school, and I got to be, their, like, little receptionist, which I wasn't very good at. Um, but I don't know, I felt like in my family, there was kind of this sense that, like, physical work in a way was higher than mental work. And that you at least, and I felt like you had to show, especially if you were male. Well, if you were female, you have to show it in other ways. Like, you have to show that you're a good steward of the resources of the house. You have to show, like, you have different skills in the kitchen and other things like that. And, like, but with the men, it's like if you were not going to actually be working with your hands, you had to show that you could.
Exactly.
Yeah, or else it was kind of like a legitimacy issue. Um, and like now, generationally speaking, it's interesting because I get a lot of female Latina students who are first gen. A lot of times, some of them have immigrated, and in their families, it's very like It it's a matter of great pride and honor that they're going to school, and it's seen as kinda like a dream and of, an accomplishment. But I noticed for my male students, sometimes there can be more of a tension where
Mhm.
there's, like, this skepticism of, "I'm not sure, right, if this is" especially or I had this one student, I'm I guess his name was Armando, and he was going to get a master's. And I remember that was a big thing in his family because it was like the men were kind of skeptical because by now, like to get the degrees is seen as good, but in my community, it's more feminized.
Yeah.
So then for
Yeah.
him to do it, it was like, you know, you have to show your bona fides in other ways. So but I kind of find Alistair McIntyre, said one time in a class of his I sat in on, as long as I promised as a grad student that I wouldn't talk
Yeah.
for undergrads, which was totally fine with me. I was just, like, happy to learn from this man. Um, he said his students that understood Aristotle the best were his night students that he taught when he lived back home. He says he has never had students get Aristotle more than they did, and he thought it was because they all had jobs, and they were having to work and go to school at the same time, and most of my students have to work and go to school at the same time, and I did have the experience when I came here that when I would teach Aristotle, it would get picked up like this. Like,
Yeah.
to the point where I'm getting questions from them that are, like, some version of what could be a master's thesis really early on. Um, and I think, like he said, it's because of the extensive practical knowledge.
Yeah. I just appreciate you sharing that, and I appreciate your background so much because I think most members of the chattering classes, people who are doing podcasts or writing academic articles are so, removed from knowing folks who work in construction and things like that, and so I feel like your life experience also bears on your research and your just understanding of what's happening in America, so it's very important because we're so disconnected, and class is a big one.
It's interesting, you say that. I had a really interesting conversation, and because, like you said, some a lot of this sorts into it can source into race, into ethnicity, but then the common denominator is class in other ways. And saying that what did that that students need a of or because he was talking about some of the anxieties he markers, status markers, things like it about long for it to come out that, it didn't take long going back to each of our grandparents and then like his girlfriend's grandparents. Like you had these examples of extreme poverty. Um, and in some cases, in what we were discussing of certain exploitative forms of labor, obviously, like the migrant work, but also sex work. And then, in a couple of generations, the kids are in college. Like, the kids of those families are in college. And how sort of the the haunting memory of extreme necessity, even if you're further away from that extreme poverty, like, it changes a lot, not just of, like, your personal decisions, but your reception of knowledge, how you interpret what you learn. And he was talking about that with his girlfriend too. She's also from, like, a blue collar background, but she goes to a really elite university. And she was just has been very alienated in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could talk
And
about
it
this
felt
for hours,
like,
but I do think,
um and I felt like, I don't know, it just made so much sense to me. It's not that far. Certain types of necessity, they teach you things like honor, they teach you things like perseverance, prioritization, drive, certain practical know-how. But then there's, like, also an inherited fear
yeah. Yeah.
can turn into, I think, part of what we were reflecting on talking about his girlfriend was, and our own experiences, was that memory of fear when you when you and when it's combined with class markers that other people are aware of. When you get into a situation that's offering you social mobility or around people who have different class experiences, you come in I think you come in feeling, I don't even know what the right word is, very self-conscious. Like,
Mhm.
there's something about you that's different, and they're gonna see it, and you're not gonna be able to hide it. And then the times where that does arise, for whatever reasons, it feels really vulnerable and revelatory. And I was wondering, I guess if you do have generations of people who lived in extreme necessity, you're very close to them, that it's trickled down to you, and some amount of shame trickles down with that, what even if it shouldn't. And so we talked about how, like, you know, I've definitely had this experience that there have been opportunities I had or places I could go where I felt like I don't have nice enough clothes like that for that, or I don't have a credit, so and then pay it over time, or stuff like that. Things I remember about being younger, or, like, a student might say, "My car, I'm driving around a car that's been in an accident,
Mhm.
and I'm invited to go to this event with some professors and other things like this. But if I go, they're going to see my car."
Mhm.
And so one of the things we talked about was that important part of being someone with those experiences and circumstances, um, who's getting these social mobility chances, is if you kind of allow yourself to feel that shame, you're withdrawing yourself from the field of social mobility.
Mhm.
And in a way, if you really do think that hard class lines are a type of injustice, you can't do that. You cannot let the shame guide you out of the opportunities, even if that means showing up with the car that's damaged or with the clothes that are wrong. And I hadn't really put together how much of a psychological component and almost hauntedness there is to all of it. 'Cause I had thought about it actually, and I've had some friends who've had, like, a bad car or something, but they have families that are doing well, and they weren't raised with such recent necessity. So if they have a bad car or something, they don't feel that shame.
Yeah.
They're not
No,
like
they feel proud.
Yeah, yes,
Like,
they
it's
think they're
kind of
cool.
like yeah, they think it's cool, yeah.
Yeah,
And it's interesting because I think with, the emphasis in when the Democrats were in charge was so much on in terms of higher ed, making access for people from different races, ethnicities, gender, sexuality. And the real barrier, of course, is always class. And
yeah,
a student, if they're white, if they're brown, if they're black, if they are working at Walmart and going to this elite college, they're going to feel alienated from their students, other students at the college who don't have to work, who have never been to a Walmart. That's the
yeah,
biggest difference is things like that. People who have to work or whose family have to work really hard versus people who have inherited wealth. And so it was a sad thing that we didn't talk enough about class. And I hope that in the future that will be more of a consideration because it informs everything culturally as well. And so I appreciate your background because I just think it makes you more literate when we have these conversations to understand how people are feeling who are not necessarily knowing how they're going to pay their electric bill this month.
yeah.
But I wanted to have you on because you have been doing in your research a deep dive into the Epstein emails. And I was hoping that you could share with us a little bit of what you've found in your reading.
Great, yeah, I'm happy to do that. Gosh, okay, so I don't know how much I should contextualize the Epstein emails. Um, with Epstein's sort of criminal enterprise, it's gone back to the point where, at one point it's a state level case, right? And then as things go on, it becomes federal. It's very clear that he has a long history of trafficking and of abuse, and that there's a really wide network of powerful players involved at different points in the timeline, and then also throughout the whole timeline. Nailing down the specifics of that story is very difficult, though. And in our sort of reception of it, I think there's a common attitude in the public that, we're dismayed by the sexual abuse. We're dismayed by the sex trafficking, but it ends up being parsed in very partisan terms, right? So it's sort of like everybody has a black hats, white hats story of Epstein. Um, and I think what the emails that have come out recently uh, with Congress, dropping those files, they're extensive. And what they show is there's no black hats, white hats narrative about sort of the left and the right or different impulses um, of our partisan politics um, that susses this out immediately. It's very complicated. I think it reveals a more interesting institutional issue, which is that I don't know if your listeners saw the picture of Bannon and Chomsky that was floating around on X and Blue Sky and stuff like that, and they're like yucking it up together. And that picture is like a part of what's been released through Epstein, the Epstein files coming out little by little in specific ways, and people were shocked. Like, how are Bannon and Chomsky friends? How are they hanging out together? Um, what's going on here? And I think that the lesson, for me at least, that's the biggest one. There's lots of particular things I can talk about. The lesson that is coming out for me about what we're learning is that the idea that there are different players, right, who are foes in our upper classes, um, is the wrong one. It seems, which is reasonable, that they have a primary interest, and that primary interest is a class interest and financial interest. And so to us, they may display as like enemies, but behind the scenes, in terms of how they're interacting with each other, there's a lot of communication and resource guarding.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, that's even a point that's independent of whatever we discover about the trafficking. Um,
It's a feeling that wealthy, rich people are getting away with things that ordinary people would never get away with. You
Absolutely.
mentioned Steve Bannon. So Steve Bannon was Trump's chief strategist in his first administration. He's the owner of Breitbart News, and the emails reveal that he was close friends with Jeffrey Epstein even before his association with the Trump campaign or with MAGA, and that his friendship with him continues all the way up until Jeffrey Epstein dies in federal prison.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that friendship? Why would Steve Bannon be friends with Jeffrey Epstein? What's that about?
Okay, fantastic question. Yeah, this is part of the big surprise, or the big thing is, I think Epstein, we know he has a connection to Trump, but um we sort of, a lot of times, that how that was parsed is that's a connection that is a part of the past, when Donald Trump was friendlier with the Clintons, and with the Democrats in general. Maybe this is a holdover. And Epstein, while there are figures on the right that are connected to him, there are, the old thing that people will always say, well, Clinton's been on his plane, Clinton's been on his plane, and he has some sort of cachet with the Democratic Party. Um, from that perspective, someone like Bannon, who's a political outsider, being connected to him, just in political terms, would seem odd. Epstein presents himself a lot more as a neoliberal. He did, kind of publicly, kind of normie, Democrat elite stuff. Bannon is someone who's always been more willing to get involved in far right things and populist stuff at a certain point. Though I think it's debatable how much he really means the populist stuff. Um, so why would these two people find each other? I think that, by the other thing that makes it unusual too is that Bannon now, he has aligned himself with Trump. By the time that Bannon is so tightly aligned with Trump, Trump and Epstein have fallen out. And they actually fell out a long time before, over a real estate deal where Epstein, well, Trump used information from their friendship to basically get a property that Epstein wanted. But Epstein felt, and he told different sources, and it's referred to in the emails, actually in an email to Ghislaine Maxwell. He thought that after their dust up, Trump and Epstein's dust up over that property, that Trump had gone to the government about his activities with
Mhm.
underage girls. So that was his suspicion all along. So they went from being fast friends to being very alienated. So when Epstein and Bannon are friends, it's unusual because Bannon and Trump are friends, right? And at a point when Epstein and Trump have been comfortable enemies for a while.
Mhm.
So all of this makes their interaction unusual, both if you're talking in terms of friends of enemies and if you're talking about ideology.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I have to figure out why this is happening. Like, I need to look into this. And what I discovered is that, and you can find some journalists who've reported on this. I can send the links to you for later. But what I discovered actually really shocked me because Epstein was giving Bannon very explicit advice on how to run a populist nationalist um, campaign. And he gave him explicit advice on using racism and using xenophobia um, as activators for political realignment. Like he told Bannon, you need to emphasize, right, specific points that have now, we can see, but become major flashpoints in your rhetoric if you want this movement to be politically powerful. He also gave him advice about things like he would watch Bannon's appearances, like his television appearances, and he would advise him about the interviews. Not only what he said, but also his camera angles or his clothing. The emails also show that, so one, Epstein's involved with the MAGA messaging deeply, it seems influential um, to Bannon's sort of sensibilities. Epstein is involved in giving sort of pointers about how to energize the political movement. And then the next thing is that Epstein's involved in networking the far right. Right. So he and Bannon are talking because Epstein is offering to Bannon, I have contacts with far right leaders in Europe. I will set up meetings between you. Right. He gives him advice also on what particular, I guess, bank accounts to use to raise money. Right. Or to move money through. Um, in the context of this type of networking.
Mhm.
Um, he advises Bannon, I'll make these contacts for you. We'll set up these meetings, but you need to be there for 2 weeks at least. And after you meet with these figures, you need to arrange a time that you're going to come back right away and communicate to them because they're going to think there's this American who's coming and he's interested in what we're doing, but it's just talk. And he'll go back to America and he'll sort of leave our ethno-nationalists part. And you need to communicate to them that you'll be in the long games, basically, that this is a political alliance, a cross-Atlantic political alliance that you're going to cultivate and develop and sustain.
Right. So you're saying that Jeffrey Epstein, convicted sex trafficker, was helping Steve Bannon network, work on messaging, and advance post-liberalism, and even meet with European dictators like Viktor Orban in Hungary in order to advance the MAGA cause, even though Jeffrey Epstein in public was presenting himself as kind of a classical liberal, typical kind of dim light middle of the road politically, but behind the scenes he was helping Steve Bannon
Right.
advance what we now know as MAGA.
Yes, exactly. And in a very conscientious way of how do we make this as polarizing as possible. I mean, that was my sensibility, right? Like, especially when he's talking about in using the concepts of race and immigration to inflame like populist passions.
It's
It's very interesting.
absolutely wild that Jeffrey Epstein was helping behind the scenes to construct what's kind of broadly known as post-liberalism, um,
Mhm.
given what a terrible guy he is. And it shows also what a terrible guy Steve Bannon is, in case
Oh yeah,
anybody didn't already know that.
right.
But I think it'd be helpful for people listening, like to distinguish terms like what is classical liberalism and what is this kind of post-liberalism that Bannon was pushing. And you mentioned like ethno-state, for example. So kind of what
Okay,
are the
great.
two things, just so we can understand?
Okay, so I'm actually gonna probably present things. I'm probably gonna let me think about this. I'm going to introduce at least 3 terms, possibly 4.
Okay.
So, I'd start off just by talking about classical liberalism or small L liberalism. It's what most of American politics for a lot of history um, has, whether you're talking about any political party that's in power, it's been within that realm, right? So what's that realm? That realm is a realm that tends to emphasize rights language, to emphasize equality before the law and arrangements of power that focus on the separation of powers.
Hmm.
It also tends to be um, not really interested in redistribution of economic resources. Um, so it's a very particular space, and we've not really moved much outside of that space, even in the depth of great disagreement. What happens, I guess you would say, as the financial scene starts to change in the US and then actually in the world markets, is you have the birth of something called neoliberalism,
Hmm.
which is um well, it's depending on who you talk to, it could have different inflections, but it seems to be an attempt to take some of the principles in liberalism and put them on an international level.
Hmm.
One of the problems with this seems to be that the international level is maybe too big for this. um, too big of a community. Another seems to be that you amplify some of the class problems in liberalism once you put them in the context of the world markets. And neoliberalism tends to be something that does not even really think too seriously about economic redistribution at all. At the same time that it oversees tremendous accumulations of wealth, right? Um, so a typical example of neoliberal would be like Hillary Clinton.
Hmm.
Um, when Trump comes onto the scene, right, the critique is that, or the sensibility, whether we're talking about people who get into Trump or people who are in Bernie, is that our governing parties are all neoliberals,
Yeah.
whether they're on the right or the left, and they're all sort of guided by this commitment to practices that lead to wealth inequality,
Yeah.
and also to things like the forever wars, which are connected, of course, to economic inequality.
Right.
So, when Trump comes on the scene, he's appearing as an outsider because he's willing to critique the forever wars. There's space for populist sentiment on the left and the right, and that gets hooked up with um, post-liberalism.
Okay.
And post-liberalism, if we're going to just talk about it in a philosophical sense, it's a philosophical critique of liberalism that in a lot of ways is critiquing neoliberalism's excesses by saying this is what liberalism always was.
Yeah.
This is what liberalism was always going to lead to. It prioritizes the individual at the expense of the community. A lot of rights language is a part of that. Um, and that one of the most, I think, radical parts of the critique is that liberalism has been sort of unmasked by neoliberalism as an oligarchical movement. And the post liberals are basically, in a sense, saying, get new oligarchs, get us, right? Get
Yeah.
us, get new authoritarians. And we'll be explicit about being authoritarians. because we have, and this is where they'll start to import their sort of transcendent commitments, whatever they might be. We have a better connection to the divine. We have a better connection to nature. In a lot of cases, we have a better connection to some pure race, or pure civilization. And post-liberalism then becomes happily sort of wedded with Mecca. I think in a lot of ways it was a wedding, at least from the perspective of populism, that didn't make a ton of sense because it's just another, at least post-liberalism as a thought process is another elite movement.
Yeah.
Um, it would be it seems to be very comfortable with neo-feudal structures, right? They're not saying, hey, you know,
Give up
typical
all your
person.
money.
Yeah, yeah. So,
I mean, it's all words, you know. I mean, just to summarize it for regular people, is the American political tradition is kind of like Hobbesian, Lockean, Jeffersonian, right? So we have individual rights, limited government, consent of the governed, equality under the law, hopefully, free speech. Um, and this kind of post-liberal critique comes both from the right in really good books like Patrick Denon's book, Why Liberalism Failed, and from the left with kind of like the Bernie and the socialists, where it says basically liberalism has destroyed communities.
right.
It has made people feel like isolated individuals who are just sort of consumers. It hasn't really cared for giving people a sense of place and community and meaningful work. And I think a lot of those criticisms of our country are valid. I enjoyed Denon's book a lot.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you also see this kind of cynical, I mean, all of this is very cynical, right? Because there's a legitimate concern that people don't have meaningful work, that liberalism has kind of alienated them from their hometown, from their faith, from other sources of meaning, a sense of love, a sense of place. Like, you grew up in Texas, you still live there, you care about it. It's made us all just kind of little atoms that float around the world trying to make money instead of feeling connected to something deeper or bigger. I think those critiques are really valid. But here you have this very cynical use of people's legitimate concerns that the system is broken in some way. And you have someone who's benefited massively, who's hugely wealthy, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and Jeffrey Epstein, who saying, let's use this dissatisfaction that people feel with our current system in order to get what we want. Let's use this wrecking ball, whether it's MAGA's beef with liberalism, or kind of the more extreme socialist version. But we're living through the MAGA, so we'll kind of focus on that right now. So why would they want to undo a system that's been so good to them? I mean, they're at the very top. Why?
That's I actually think this is, in some ways, the answer to this is an answer to how did Epstein and Bannon hook up.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of post-liberalism to me, and Tucker Carlson embodies this for me in a lot of ways. It's like, get rid of your old elite to welcome your new, like, real elites that are, ta me, you
Yeah.
know? Like,
100.
and it starts in Epstein, in Bannon, in post-liberalism, some of those figures generally, that you can have these people who feel like, and in maybe a lot of respects are, uh, talented, um, insightful, but were excluded by the dominant forces of society, like for being too conservative, for in Epstein's case, for being a child rapist, whatever. Right. And so there's this hurt and resentment of not being given enough recognition, not being given enough power, not being accepted by the other powerful people.
Right.
And Bannon and Epstein have that in common. Um, I think you have in post-liberalism a similar thing, right? What's their interest in populism? Their interest in populism is the force of the will of the people to destroy present power structures, but not to change the material conditions of the people, but to come in and basically insert themselves into the top of the hierarchy.
Exactly.
This is in a lot of ways really a battle about who should be at the top of the hierarchy. The neoliberalism, post-liberalism battle is elites battling with each other about who should be on the top.
Yes, 100%. I think both, there's a sense in both that they think there's going to be kleptocracy either way, and I want it to be me who rules it. And
Right.
it's really a kind of dark and not
Yes.
very idealistic worldview. And you saw that with Doge, right, where he made these beautiful promises in some ways. Elon Musk, I'm going to give everyone their money back. I'm going to get rid of all this waste and fraud and corruption and make the system run more efficiently. Who wouldn't want that? And what does he really do? He comes in and he gets rid of all the agencies that regulate his companies. He makes sure that he's going to make a lot more money. It's a massive grift. And then he shuts it down. You know, he
Right.
breaks things and then he shuts it down, and nobody gets that $5,000 check, and things don't actually run better. And oh, yes, sorry, lots of people in the developing world are going to die. It's just
Right.
like none of the promises that are legitimate in some ways come true, because
Yeah.
he's actually motivated in what's in it for him, especially someone like Musk, who's just completely self-interested, you know.
Mhm.
That's my read of him as a person. An
Yeah.
interesting thing you talked to me about was that you had Epstein and Bannon in the emails released by the DOJ talking about the Me Too movement.
Yeah. Okay. So this is
Speaking about what's in it for them, right?
yeah, speaking of what's in it for them, right? And speaking of grievances,
Yeah.
um driving things, Bannon's sort of early pitch in the emails to Epstein about connecting on this point is that, like, he basically says,
We can get rid of the Me Too movement.
yeah, we can, are you interested in something, right, that would neuter sort of this movement, nip it in the bud? Um, and I think that, well, one question would be, why would Me Too as a movement be something that would be nippable by MAGA? If MAGA is supposed to be the disenfranchised, like, voice. And I think the answer is, like, in the emails too, in the sense that when you've got Epstein pointing out to Bannon, hey, use alienated people's frustration by having them scapegoat, particular racial and ethnic groups, uh, and make them think that MAGA will punish those things, right? And in a way, the punishment of those things will make their condition better. I think with Me Too, it's a similar sort of, like, well, Me Too is a problem of hierarchy. So if you use MAGA's fury at inequalities and a sense of alienation, and you redirect it to some group that they don't perceive themselves as being a part of, right?
Mhm.
Then that's a great way of harnessing that energy. So
Right.
Me Too is another example of I think the magnet belief that the problems in the world are a problem of a disordered hierarchy, that people who really believe in the promises of MAGA think MAGA will restore their place in it, right?
Yeah.
And in that sense, you know, Me Too is obviously appealing to Epstein, for just practical reasons. Like, at one point, Bannon even seems to indicate that he can get him out of the country so he doesn't face jail time, right?
Mm.
But, um, so there's the practical point, but there's also, again, this sense with Bannon and Epstein and a lot of the elites involved in post-liberalism discussion that we can use the people or populism's force through their alienation to basically, I have to be careful how I say this.
Get more power.
To get more power, but specifically more power over people who are beneath us by nature.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't seem that, explicit that Epstein is making an argument about people being beneath him by nature, because he's a trafficker of children and a rapist, and you don't have to have some big theory or perspective about, hierarchy to do that. But what we know from Epstein's own description of his violation of these girls is he didn't think what he did was that bad.
Right.
Because as he put it was the same thing as like swiping a bagel. That's what he said. So these are girls from, in a lot of cases, especially the earliest cases, socially inferior families. They're white families. They're poor, or at least poorer in an area where there's a lot of wealth. And to him, they're
They're
just kind
trash.
of there for consumption. Yeah, they're
Yeah,
trash.
they're trash.
And
They're
actually, Elaine
disposable.
calls them trash
Yeah.
in one of her interviews. And so, what is the trick I think that's happening here is someone like Bannon, someone like Epstein, they have this sense of the people that are beneath them and that are trash. And that will include the people that they want to harness for MAGA, right?
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
they can do this feint where they can grab those people's resentment as power, right, against specific groups, then they will. And they'll have to have a pretense of not seeing that voter as these other groups that they're targeting. They'll have to
Yeah.
pretend that.
I mean, you said a lot of things that I want to respond to because there's a lot in there. I mean, I think people remember the Me Too movement. It started as a hashtag. I think it was about, at first, a famous director who exploited female actresses. I forget his name.
Yeah.
Um,
Weinstein.
you said it?
Yeah, Weinstein.
Weinstein, thank you. Yeah. And I'm kind of a contrarian by nature. And I do think, every movement has its excesses, and Me Too did as well, where there were very legitimate things that came to light of serial sex abusers. And then there were people who were saying, somebody whistled at me. And I'm like, that's not really a crime.
Right.
And I think one of the problems with liberals and conservatives is they can kind of egg each other on to more and more extreme positions. And so it starts out with a very legitimate call for justice where sexual harassment, stalking, rape, these are serious crimes that have gone not punished in most instances. And then it could become this kind of pile on of, oh, somebody asked me out and it was awkward and I feel unsafe. And you're thinking, oh, come on, liberals, you're going too far. Life is awkward sometimes. You're not unsafe because someone asked you out. Just say, I'm not interested. Women are strong. So I also, as a contrarian, was critical of some of the excesses of Me Too, even though I think it was an important movement to talk about the way women are treated, sometimes, especially in certain industries like entertainment. And so here you have these really bad guys. And then this goes to the hierarchy thing you're talking about. Epstein is a serial sex abuser. He traffics in young girls, wanting to end Me Too because they see it as a legitimate threat to their actual illegal enterprises. And also, something you said that's so interesting is that they believe in a natural hierarchy where, among other things, men are at the top. And they should be allowed to do what men are naturally, kind of all of this pseudoscience language, going to do. And that they are naturally superior and they should get what they want. And if they want a girl who's underage, they should be able to take her, especially if she's from a lower class and they pay her money and they have all these justifications to say, I'm actually, helping this person.
Right.
She's lucky to be abused by me. And so it's a very tricky thing because they take a legitimate concern of, okay, there were some times where Me Too went too far. Dating relationships can be messy and not that's not always a criminal. And then you have actual criminals, right? The two separate things that get conflated into one big conversation. And it's very weird that these old ideas, these kind of 1920s, 1930s ideas of hierarchy, what's old is new again, with putting white people on the top, men at the top, certain ethnic groups, even certain religions are being ranked. And so ethno-nationalism fits with that because it says, look, this is kind of natural, sort of social Darwinism. They want to make these kind of pseudoscientific claims that some people matter and some
Right.
people don't, kind of Ayn Rand, some people matter, some people don't. And that's really disturbing and very much kind of in the water right now, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and hearing you speak actually reminds me of some other parts of the emails with other interlocutors, where Epstein is really interested in uh, evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. He's also interested in race science, and it's all stuff that, in a way, is he thinks he's using science to justify his priors. His priors are I'm on top, right? So whether you're talking about abusing girls or you're talking about racial hierarchies, he's interested in arguments that will sort of justify this as something natural. And like you pointed out, everything old is new again. If we were to go back and look at um certain thinkers that would, for example, become really influential for Mussolini, or figures like that, they are very interested in pseudoscientific arguments about natural hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really publicly deploying that type of argumentation. It's almost identical. It's kind of creepy. The thing that's different, though, I've noticed, and this is just kind of an aside about some of the post-liberals generally, especially the ones who identify as accelerationists. And accelerationists tend to be very dramatic about, they're like, we're in a period that needs to end because it's unjust and unnatural, specifically because of equality. And so we need to accelerate the decline, um, through catastrophe, through violence, through whatever. And there's lots of different forms of that argument. But when you look at a lot of those thinkers or political figures, they don't they are sort of interested, a lot of them are, in race biology type stuff and evo psych type things. And like I mentioned in the past, the past versions of those scientific arguments were important for these type of movements. But they've got a metaphysical argument going on.
Okay.
And some of them will talk about Nick Land is probably the in some ways the clearest person on this, what they call birth cultures. So they don't just talk about it in terms of biology, like, for example, white versus black or whatever genetic DNA questions like that you see some people get into. They also will say, well, birth cultures have a sort of spiritual ranking,
Mm-hmm.
and white Western birth cultures are superior.
Yeah.
Right, and all others are ranked. So, like, Curtis Yarvin, who used to be called Moldbug and is, like, now sanitized, right, like, the New York Times, and everyone's pretending like he's a serious thinker. He used to have this blog, right, where he was Moldbug, and he was ranting about these things, and he talks about a racial hierarchy, and he says, Black people are the lowest, and spiritually, they're the lowest. uh, I'm a Latina, so he calls us swarthy helots. So we're like, yeah, we're like a slave worker class, right? There's too many of us in the country, and there's like an invasion of us coming. Asians are higher than us, and then whites are, of course, the highest. And he's not just talking about in terms of biology. He's talking in terms of spirituality, or I guess maybe a metaphysical quality. And so now when he gets out there and he's making arguments about immigration and or other sort of national identity, post-liberalism type stuff, right? He's doing it in a cleaner language, but in his mind is this very kind of shocking, spiritualized racism. And Bannon's into that stuff too. And like Nick Land, who a lot of the, I guess you say, tech guys that are connected to all the post-liberalism stuff, and very influential in it. Nick Land is a thinker they're very interested in. And at one point he says, look, certain birth cultures are simply going to be fodder. Like they have to be consumed, they have to be used to bring on the advancement of the conditions of the world.
Oh, I hate hierarchies. I hate them so much. I don't believe in the natural hierarchy. All this stuff is so evil and wicked to me. The idea that certain people are worth more than other people, I think, is kind of the root of all evil. But so I'll talk about the left, and then I want to respond to what you're saying that's happening on the far right. So on the left, definitely. I think everyone has a metaphysics or a theology, whether they're religious or not, whether they're aware of it or not. I remember I have a friend who's never been to church a day in his life, and he was like, God is a Black trans woman. And I was like, God is not male or female, or, God doesn't have race beyond all these categories which were made by humans to class us. I mean, these categories were created in many cases for the purposes of oppression. And so, of course, God would transcend all of those categories. But anyway, I was like, that's silly, right? God is beyond all of these categories. But here on the right, you're seeing what is so crazy to me is this renewal of eugenics, which was actually, I don't think a lot of people know the history, huge in the 1920s and 30s in the United States of America, and huge in the Anglo-Protestant church. I just want to recommend this book because I'm a super nerd. It's called Conceiving Parenthood. I don't know if people have read this. It's by Amy Hall. She's a professor at Duke. And this is an incredible book. I learned so much from it. But this idea of good and bad blood, fit and unfit children, pure and impure races, unfortunately has a long history in the United States, even in mainline Protestant, even in so-called Christian churches that were preaching this from the pulpit, right? Which was that, especially with Latinos and Catholics, we need to reduce their numbers, that they are inferior, what you're talking about, them being only good for certain type of jobs, which were considered, like manual labor. The conversation about Blacks, of course, that they were only fit for these lower roles in society. So all of these very evil ideas are kind of being, changed a little bit, burnished up a little bit, but coming back out where you're having people say, we need certain types of people to have a lot of children, right? Like Elon Musk thinks that he is the kind of person who should obviously have a huge number of children. Donald Trump constantly talks about low IQ individuals, which is always code typically for a Black woman or a person of color. So it's pretty clear overt eugenics of some people should live here and should have huge families. And we're looking at these pictures of men with many children from many women and saying, this is the dream. And they all happen to be white men. I'm thinking of Hegseth, right? He should have lots of women. He should have a harem. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein, I had heard that there was thoughts that he was going to have a baby making farm in New Mexico, where he wanted a lot of little Jeffreys because he thinks he's the kind of person who should reproduce and have a family. And yet, when poor people have children, when people of color have children, when immigrants come here, they say, oh, we have a population problem. You say, great, we have all these immigrants who want to come here and have the American dream. And they don't mean those kind of people.
Right.
And that is a horrible, horrible thing that is coming back into our culture. And people also in the 1920s and 30s used kind of pseudoscientific language, social Darwinism. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but they used to have like fitter family fairs at like state fairs where they would measure
Wow.
your child face and head and all this kind of Nazi stuff of the ideal baby had certain traits. And so I don't really see it as very different when you're looking at people in this movement who are talking about using IVF to create this perfect child who will
Right.
not have diseases or a quote unquote low IQ. It's very
Right.
concerning because these old ideas are coming back in through the back door to say, we just really want to have a flourishing, healthy family. And it's like, what do you mean by that? Who's
Yeah.
who's like who's being held up as healthy and
Hmm.
correct, and who's being treated like we shouldn't have Vance said we shouldn't have 15 people living in a house. It's like, okay, that feels very like what's old is new again, right?
Yeah.
Only
Yes.
people who have a certain economic level should be allowed to live in a house, and the house should have two kids, and one should be a
Right.
boy and one should be a girl. And it's
Hmm.
just all that same propaganda from the past
Yeah.
coming up again.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right, and you're right that the new technology we have, in a way, is making it not just different, perhaps more possible,
Yeah.
right?
Because
Or
in the
practical.
past, you had the overt eugenics, where there was a huge push in American history to sterilize whole groups of people. And that really did actually happen. You can look it up. And people like Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, were in support of that, of sterilizing people who were quote unquote low IQ, etc. And
Right.
then and then today, maybe it's not overt like that, saying we should sterilize those people, but it's saying we shouldn't allow them to come here. They're a drain on society. They're going to take your tax dollars. Or it's overt in the sense of you shouldn't have children, quote unquote, naturally. You should use science to design the perfect embryo or the
Right.
perfect baby with the right traits. And that's a metaphysics and a theology, like you were saying, whether or not you call it that or not, whether or not you're aware of it or not, where you're saying there's the right way, there's a morality embedded in that. I mean, Donald Trump constantly talks about his daughter as the most beautiful, perfect form of a human, and she has long blonde hair and a certain type of look. And it has kind of a yucky history that people need to be aware
Absolutely.
of.
Absolutely. You're exactly right. I think, in a way, this points to something that you talked about earlier. Um, when you pointed out there are these moments of, I guess you might say, entry or potential entry, when there's a valid point, right? Like, maybe it is excessive to view male female courtship is inherently predatory, right?
Right.
Um, or, maybe it is true that we, want to think about nutrition more as we live in an era with more processed foods, and we want to think about how that impacts child development, right? And so that is an invitation, and it's makes a lot of sense. But it's like, you'll get a pitch like that from certain movements, and it can become a doorway into really insane things,
Right.
No,
You can start
because
with something
circle.
really small, right? People don't
Yeah.
go right away to like, I'm forming a cult and I want to influence.
Yeah.
They start with, people should have more babies. I think that's great.
Right,
I love babies. Or
right,
we've gone too far in saying that every woman needs to work outside the home. Lots of women want to be homemakers. I
right.
agree, right? But
Yes,
then it can go pretty quickly incrementally to women should not be allowed to work outside the home
mhm, right,
because men are doers and achievers and women are passive and receivers. And it's
right,
kind of this slippery slope that starts with something that a lot of people would agree with. of men and women are different, or being a mother is a wonderful thing,
Right.
or different ethnicities have different cultural values. All of these things I think are pretty non-remarkable claims, but it can go quickly down this kind of slippery slope to ranking this hierarchy that there are ethnicities that are good and that are bad, that women are inferior and men are born to lead. There's no woman ever who was good at leading. I mean, of course, anytime you say always and never, that's wrong. I met some women who are like incredible, I would put in charge of our country. So that kind of overly generalizing from something that might be true in certain instances, right? But not in every case are men better at doing things like math than women. But they want to use these kind of small differences or things that they'll say. I think another thing they do that's kind of really effective is they say people are afraid to talk about this. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm just coming as a truth teller. Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
a lot of men like younger women, and I'm so brave because I'm talking about this.
Yeah.
And yes, that's true, but then it can go quickly to from brave truth teller to I'm grooming you for
Yeah.
something that you didn't sign up for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's so interesting you say that. Actually, I've noticed this. I mean, insofar as we're talking about post-liberalism generally, this is a way that I would say figures, like whether you're more philosophical figures or more sort of like podcaster energy, public figure energy. Um, with both of them, they'll do this sort of way of building up legitimacy in exactly the mode you're saying. They'll say something that other people think is reasonable, but maybe is not said. And then it actually snowballs to where it becomes a virtue in itself. Instead of virtue signaling, it's vice signaling. Like Nick Fuentes is a great example of this. He's like, I'm going to be the most racist, most terrible person in the world and say all of this, and I'm just going to do it because I'm so brave and committed to the truth. And now everything I say, you need to believe right now
That's
because I'm such a racist. How could I lie to you? Like this is the thing they do. It's like edgelord, 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 and then legitimacy gaining. And it's
mhm.
working because people say, they're a truth teller,
Mhm.
right? And it's a perverse and well, I mean, not that virtue signaling is great, but vice signaling sounds worse even.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't want to be, I think, kind of my stereotype of liberals is they can be such scolds.
Yeah.
They can be like, oh gosh, someone whistled at a woman. It's like, come on, man, lighten up. We're just trying to have a good time. It's a Friday night. They can be kind of prudish or scolds.
Mhm.
And what's happening right now on the right is the opposite of this kind of vice signaling that you're talking about, where it's saying, look, I have this secret forbidden knowledge. It's straight out of like the book of Genesis. And you
Right.
want it, don't you? But it's pretty messed up and dark, but it'll give you all this power because you'll know
Right.
this secret knowledge that everyone else is afraid to talk about, which is that, fill in the blank.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
No,
that's,
you're 100%
that's, go ahead.
No, you're 100% right, and the secret knowledge point I think is really important. That's actually a thing that I kinda noticed with all this post-liberalism where we're talking about the academic forums or the public forums or the political forums. The secret knowledge Gnostic vibe is big in all of it, right? Like, it kind of preys, I think, on alienated people's insecurities and wanting to be kind of like special in some way, and B, their sort of sense of bewilderment, reasonable bewilderment about the world and the way it is. And so this Gnostic pitch of I've got this secret knowledge, I've got this dark knowledge, I'm gonna initiate you into it. It's a big part of the
Yeah, and I think in the West, Gnosticism gets this really good rap because it's like, oh, the secret gospels and, the excluded voices. But there's kind of a dark side of this Gnostic accelerationism that we're seeing with Peter Thiel and a lot of these people who are calling themselves Christian. But what they really believe is that there's a secret knowledge, there's elite people like themselves who possess it, and that it's not actually accessible. So it's the opposite of Christianity, right? Which is like, here comes everybody. Everybody gets the
Right.
exact same sacraments. It's very equal, right?
Right.
Everybody gets the
Yes.
exact same Eucharist, the exact same amount. There's no male or female. They hate this quote from the Bible. They hate it so
Right.
much. So I'm going to say no male or female, no Greek or Jew, and no slave or free, that we're all one. So there's a lot of equality kind of built into Orthodox Christianity, but theirs is kind of an opposite, which is that they love that there's hierarchy and better and worse, and special people who have special knowledge, but not
Right.
regular folks. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. 100%.
Yeah. So the Epstein emails, this is kind of like a random transition, but I did want to talk about it with you because we're both elder millennials and I'm sure you've seen it. It made me think a lot about the wonderful 50 Cent documentary on
Yes.
Sean Combs. I'm just going to call him Diddy because that's what we grew up calling
Yeah.
him. It's called The Reckoning. And I think there's a lot of parallels to the Epstein scandal and to that documentary. I don't know if you have thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that well, I mean, first of all, what a blast from the past, like 50 Cent.
I know.
I mean, my heart just soared when I was watching that Super Bowl where he comes down, right? He's doing that's kind of how I viewed this documentary. It's like him, again, jumping onto my screen to do a sit up of hanging. But anyways, yeah, the vibe is so the same. Well, especially if well, we could talk specifically about the documentary, but especially if you start to delve into some of the things that Diddy himself seems to believe that are very esoteric, and are very sort of like higher, lower, right? I'm a master, you're a lower type or a slave, right, is really central to a lot of his behavior. But I think the similarity, like with Epstein, that kept kind of hitting me in the face is, um it's an open secret in these networks what these men do, right? Everybody around them knows who else knows what they know, and there's a certain confidence that allows it to be an open secret of we're the kinds of people that are above the law. Our fame, our money, our friendships. And it hits also in both cases. You see this thing that I think makes oligarchy or kleptocracy so insidious is their friendships are centered around exploitation. So
Mhm.
it's not just their practices, like economic practices, their right, maybe what they do with their contracts with artists, for example, Diddy, how what he signs people up for, how he treats his artists, that kind of thing, which is notoriously bad. It's not just that side of it, but in his social life itself, like in Epstein's social life itself, the form of everything takes a form of exploitation,
Yeah.
and exploitation that's an open secret.
Yeah. I mean, you see, it's a fantastic documentary. 50 Cent should be so proud of it. I think it's really well done. It's heavy, but it's really well done. You see similarities that they both abuse men and women sexually. They um, commit violent crimes, financial crimes, all kinds of stuff that as you said correctly, were an open secret. And then the people working for them or with them are afraid. Okay,
Mhm,
he's going to have 9 lawyers. How am I ever going to get justice? Or he's going to ruin my reputation. No one will ever hire me in the industry again. And you see
mhm,
how powerful people get away with things for a long time
mhm,
because people are afraid to speak up. And hopefully, this hard moment in American history will be empowering more people because you see how when one person came out against Diddy, then more people
yes,
came. And there's strength in numbers for ordinary people to get hopefully some accountability, although still he got a slap on the wrist of 50 months in jail And the documentary is pretty damning that he's deserving of a life sentence. So it's a process, but you can see the beginning of the reckoning. It was well titled.
Yeah.
Because what's so strange to me about these really bad guys is that regular people like us, we cannot understand them. It's the problem of evil. We can't explain it. And so we know, like, we live in America in this very kind of, anyone can get on Tinder and like find someone. Anyone can get on Hinge. And yet these people want power, and they're sadistic, and they want to do things that are beyond even that. So
Right.
it's not normal interactions. Anyone could find someone. Diddy could find someone of age who wanted to have a consenting relationship with him. Epstein could have found someone of age any time of day who wanted to have a consenting relationship with them. But that's not what it's about for them. It's about being cruel. It's about power and control. It's about this
Yeah.
slave master relationship. And you see how Sean Combs does that, where, like these other guys who invoke Jesus and Christianity, sometimes he says things like, God bless, I love Jesus, to his victims. He'll say these things. And then other times he'll say, I am Jesus. And you're like, wow, that's really dark.
No,
I am God. I am the law. And what I say, you have to do. And so it's definitely more about this kind of malignant narcissist personality than it is about a person who like loves women or likes to party. I think we all know that guy, and he's not so bad. This is something different. That's coming to light, and that I hope people on the left and right are following, because we grew up with these guys. That's part of why it made it such a good documentary, is we grew up loving this music.
Yes.
I did. I loved it. I mean, I watched MTV after school like every day.
Me too. Me too. And like, you know, hearing you talk about it too, it makes me think about, sort of your important emphasis at the beginning of this conversation on class. Because one thing that, whether we're talking about watching this documentary, right? And sort of like, especially coming from that time, right, remembering it all in a really, really real way, in a shared way, right, across racial lines. Or you're talking about, sort of the general public interest in what Epstein did. I mean, when we are so polarized socially, right, to think of ourselves as alien to each other because of race and in a hierarchical way, or alien to each other because of a left-right divide. The upshot of that is that our shared outrage, right, our shared sense of, this type of oligarchical exploitation is like destroying the fabric of civil society, right? Not just the political structure, but the civil structure too. We can't be a coalition together, right? And if we could, that would be the thing that would unseat a lot of the oligarchical energy, because it could bring accountability and expectation, right? But if we're divided by political polarization and we're divided by racial alienation, then the sort of natural affinity we might have with each other as people who are sort of on the receiving end of oligarchical abuse, it's destroyed.
That's right. That's right. And that's why identity politics is such a, it fails, I think, ultimately, because you look at the history of, for example, like workers' rights, rich landowners always wanted to make the Black sharecroppers and the brown sharecroppers and the Irish sharecroppers hate each other so that they couldn't organize together to negotiate for fairer wages or better working conditions. And so people are made to be divided so that the people who have a lot can continue to be doing the things they're doing, which now we know, because of the Epstein emails and because of the Diddy doc and all of these things, are sometimes worse than just greed. It's actual crime. And so we need to kind of all come together. And these are games that are being played in order to divide us and make us see each other as enemies instead of being like, hey, we live in the same neighborhood. I think Theo
Right.
Vaughn's really good on that. He talks about growing up poor as a poor white. And he's like, me and you live in the same neighborhood. So whoever took our stuff,
Right.
they took both our stuff.
Yes.
And that's where
Yes.
you build coalition, is for all people who are middle class or just regular folks saying, look, I don't
Yes.
want to live in a country where these people are committing crimes and not being held accountable. I don't want to live in a country where I'm told to hate my neighbor. Like, I want both of us to be doing better,
Right. Yeah.
and have a better life. And our interests are actually intertwined. So
Mhm.
that's kind of why I think Bannon hated Pope Francis, is because he was constantly building bridges
Yes,
and trying to get
absolutely.
people to see that your interests are intertwined with the
Absolutely.
interests of your neighbor.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, Bannon, there's a lot of people you could talk of as being especially dark in all of this. But in some ways, he's the one that disturbs me the most. He's the
Mm-hmm.
most Machiavellian. Um, and in some ways, there a lot of all of these people are shameless liars.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that's kind of interesting about it. I think it's because of their confidence and their superiority, the way they're confident about being above the law, they're also confident about speaking reality. Like, it doesn't matter if something's true or not. If they say it, they're kind of the source of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Bannon is really willing to use any language, any posturing at all to get power and influence that he wants, right?
Yeah.
So the religious language, the populist language, a lot of times to me, if you poke it, it all falls apart very quickly. The thing that Bannon wants most of all is to be in charge.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why, like, the Diddy doc was so sad, is because I watched that MTV Music Awards after Biggie had died, and I loved that performance. And it's like, oh, Puff Daddy was a great performer. I mean, Sting was singing,
Yes.
and he had the gospel choir, and I had
Yes.
chills, And so some people are very convincing. I
Yeah.
completely believed that he was grieving his
Me
friend,
too.
and then you find out, oh, he's ripping off the family and making them play for the funeral. And so it's easy
Mhm.
to get tricked. People do get tricked by someone who's very charming and very talented in other ways, but is ultimately a liar. And so that's where I have compassion for people who also maybe got tricked by some of this, language and
Yeah.
sucked into it, because it's anybody can get tricked, dude.
That's so true.
I thought that performance was completely sincere. And I think as a sincere person, or as a naive or innocent person, it's easy to think that other people are also telling you the truth because you're telling the truth.
You're so
So,
right. And it
you know,
corrupts everything. When you bring that up, I have exactly the same emotional attachment to that performance. I remember
mhm,
it. And actually on the Day of the Dead for years, like even as recently as last year, I remember doing this after I got married, which was kind of when I started doing my own altar, was I would play I'll Be Missing You.
yeah,
And as a way of honoring, like, the people that I was missing, and so, when I saw this documentary and I'm thinking about this performance and I'm looking at this performance and I'm seeing, like, how evil this guy on it I'm like, "This is a dance on his grave, right? This is
yeah,
a dance on" and now I have spent years celebrating the memory of my dad with this performance where this man is dancing on someone's grave, and I'm so pissed because
yeah,
I feel like I'm now complicit, right? Or something so beautiful and meaningful to me, like my loved ones who are gone. Now, his foulness is a part of it. And so this really beautiful shared thing, like mourning and honoring your dad, one of the most evil things about figures like Diddy or any of these other types is I think they know that our human nature needs that type of stuff because it's good.
mhm,
And then they say, okay, so um because you're gonna gravitate to it, it's a source of my power.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like they take things that are good about us, like our desire for love, our loyalty, our emotion, our grief. I mean, I was telling my husband, he came in and I was like, this is my whole childhood. Like I wondered my whole childhood who killed Tupac. I wondered my
Right.
whole childhood what happened to Biggie. Like my mind is blown, you know. I had no idea anyway. But they take something really good about us and they kind of twist it. And so that is where I have compassion for people who get sucked into something and then they go, whoa, 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 because it could happen to anybody. And so far as it starts out with something good, of I want to be a recording artist. I thought it was so interesting that Diddy had a reality TV show where he
Yeah.
basically abused, and we were like, oh, a strong man. He's like, I'll make you walk to get me a cheesecake. And I was like, that's funny because Trump had a reality TV show like that where we
Mhm.
watched him say, you're fired, you know, and we kind of
Yes.
loved that they were strong and authoritative and they wanted people to work hard. These are kind of good things, but then it could be masking this other darker side of this is on that fine line towards an abusive person. So
Mhm.
I think in both cases, they're very good entertainers and people saw maybe some kernel of goodness and they couldn't see the other stuff because they're not bad people.
Right.
And
Right.
so it doesn't come naturally for them to assume that other people would be doing some of the things that they're doing. So it
Mhm.
can be easy to get tricked and manipulated.
I
I am
I think
so, go ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, that's so true, and it just made me think you with what you're saying, it's like, I think there needs to be more social space for saying, "I was tricked and I was wrong." Because if you don't have that place for that, then what you get is what we see now, which is this sort of crazy cultish doubling down, where you have to move the goalpost of what you're okay with further and further and further and further because you don't wanna have to admit that you're wrong, so you have to kind of change what you would be more likely to be okay with. There's actually a South Park called Doubling Down from a couple of seasons ago when, Mr. Garrison becomes the president, and this one girl is dating Cartman and then breaks up with him, and the friends are like, "Oh my god, we can't believe you ever dated him. We're so happy you're not with him anymore. How could you be so dumb? Could you not see what was happening? Blah, 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 blah." And then she starts saying, "Well, actually, he's really great. And actually, he did this." And then, like, before you know it, she's back with him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this
Mm-hmm.
embarrassment of saying, "I was wrong." Right.
Yeah, I'm going to let you have the last word because I think that's exactly right. And I'm so thankful for your time. I think people
Oh,
need to be able to say, hey, guess what? Everybody gets it wrong sometimes, everybody gets tricked sometimes. And that doesn't mean you have to stay. You can always say, okay, enough. And there were some really brave people in that documentary who talked about their moment. That was their moment where they
yes.
said, okay, enough. I am
Yeah.
done. And this is violating my deep, sacred sense of right and wrong. I'm so
Mhm.
thankful for you, Ashleen. Thank you
I'm
for
so
your good
thankful
work
for
and your
you.
deep digging. We'll do it another time. Thank you.
Thank you for you. Thank you so
Thanks for listening.